Mace. I work for Oréade-Brèche in France, and I was in charge of conducting the French case study, which was on experimental evaluation tools for interventions. So the case study took place in France at a regional level. Tool category is quantitative model, and the tool used was experimental evaluation tools. This refers to a broad category of tools which are usually used to generate data in a controlled setting, and then to analyze the relationships between the measure or the scheme of interests and the people's actual behavior or their stated intentions. And so, as I just said, it's a broad category of tools. We focused on only one of them, which is discrete choice experiment. And this particular method, is usually used to assess farmers' preferences regarding certain policy measures, and in particular to evaluate under which conditions they would be willing to get enrolled in a scheme. And so it's based on data that's collected through a carefully designed protocol where farmers actually have to choose the policy option that they prefer between different hypothetical scenarios. So the case study focused on one particular CAP measure, which is managed by the Occitanie region, whom we were working. It focuses on protein autonomy in the livestock sector, but I don't think I'm going to focus too much on that. That particular measure didn't receive the uptake that was expected by the region when they implemented it, and so they wanted to know why the uptake was rather low, and to see how the measure could maybe be changed or adapted in order to improve the uptake and therefore the effectiveness of that measure. And so the expected contributions to CAP design, monitoring, and evaluation of the tools such as discrete choice experiment is in general to support a more effective ex-ante policy design and to provide insights on drivers and barriers to uptake. So this slide quickly sums up the overall methodology, or at least dynamic and reflection behind a discrete choice experiment. So it comes in the format of a survey that is sent to farmers, in which there are different structured choice scenarios that are presented to farmers, and where they have to choose the policy option that they prefer. Each of the scenarios presents alternative combination of the policy or of the program attributes, which are basically the main characteristics. Elena mentioned it at the beginning. It can be the level of payment, if there's technical support, or particular practices that farmers have to implement, etc. And so that methodology allows us to quantify and evaluate the trade-offs that farmers are willing to make between different policy attributes, and also the value that they give to each of these attributes. To put that methodology, to implement it, we need different inputs. The main ones are what I call policy information, which is basically an in-depth description of the policy program or the measure that you want to study, so that you can extract or identify all of the relevant characteristics, and mainly the one that will really, or that you expect to really have an impact on farmers' decision process, and whether or not they will get enrolled in the scheme. And the most important one, is the monetary attribute. So in our case, it was the level of payment that farmers would receive to get enrolled in the scheme. Because that particular attribute, it allows us to quantify, as I say, farmers' preferences, the trade-offs, etc. So it's really what gives the added value to the methodology. Throughout the process, it's really important that managing authorities and stakeholders are involved. I put the little pictograms in the main steps, so it's mainly for the inputs collection, because it's a very long and tedious process where you have to identify which measure you want to work on, define the attributes, and then there's several steps of communication with various stakeholders to make sure that the attributes that you selected are the most important or relevant ones. So you can organize focus groups. You have to pre-test all of your choice scenarios to make sure that your design is the best possible or optimal for the results that you want to achieve. And so it's really that protocol design is really the key steps. And so it's very important to be in relationship. In our case, it was with the region at this moment, but with the managing authority at this moment. Here I just put an example of a choice card scenario that farmers can be presented with to illustrate a little bit what a discrete choice experiment looks like. So you can see 3 different alternatives. Each one of them is defined by their attributes. And in a single choice scenario, you have different levels of one attribute that is proposed. And so farmers have to choose which alternatives they find more interesting. This is not the final card that we designed in our case, but it was just to illustrate different kinds of attributes that you can have. In our case, however, in the end, we couldn't use or implement a monetary attribute, which is the amount of payment. It was a decision from the region, so we couldn't implement it in the methodology, and so it kind of hindered our process. And so we decided to change our global methodological approach during the case study. And so from the discrete choice experiment, we actually went to another tool, which is called the theory of planned behavior. It's a very different tool, but it's actually aiming at analyzing similar things. And in particular, in our case, our goal was to understand what are the drivers or what can hinder farmers' participation in a scheme. And so a theory of planned behavior also allowed us to analyze these elements. However, whereas discrete choice experiment really focuses on the scheme characteristics, theory of planned behavior, it looks more at external drivers that can impact farmers' behavioral intentions. I put some example of social influences, attitude, the perceived control, etc. And so in the end, we managed to design a final survey that was then sent to farmers that the main thing in their survey was the theory of planned behavior, but we also added some elements from the discrete choice experiment in order to still get some insights on the scheme's characteristics. So in the end, our outputs kind of changed a little bit, and it allowed us to identify farmers' priorities, key factors, the potential measure that could be put in place to boost adoption, but we couldn't quantify their preferences or quantify the trade-offs. So as I just mentioned, the main results was for us to understand behavioral drivers of participation. We could identify key factors that influence farmers' engagement, how they felt towards the scheme, how they perceived if the practices that they had to implement were actually implementable, what were the economic constraints or other constraints, and also to identify their preferred policy design feature. We identify which practices were more feasible, more attractive to them, maybe which which practices could face greater resistance, the reasons behind it, and we really focused on non-financial barriers, so mainly the administrative complexity, time constraints, the perceived autonomy in farm management, and etc. For the lessons learned, what we can take from that case study is that experimental economics and integrating behavioral factors in policy design, it's highly valuable because it's helped us to identify the barriers to uptake, to develop more targeted measures, and to take into account farmers' preferences, their motivations, and their constraints, and so to design more effective measures. In the future, experimental tools, but mainly discrete choice experiments, it's more effective if it's implemented in ex-ante policy design. I saw that there was a question on ex-post tools, and there are some experimental tools that are more effective in an ex-post setting, but it's not the case of the discrete choice experiments. And so, yeah, it allows the design of the measure, but it can also be used in itinerary to adjust certain schemes parameters. However, since these tools, they're very, well, they take a lot of time, they can be expensive, and they require a certain level of technical knowledge. They're more useful when you have a problem that is clearly defined, the stakeholders are all engaged throughout all of the process, there's sufficient time and there's sufficient technical expertise. It's not optimal, however, with constraints such as tight timelines. If you're not sure that you can get a large enough sample of farmers to actually answer the survey, or in our case as well, when the implementing authority has limited control over the key policy elements, and so they won't be able to make the changes that they are actually mentioning in the experiment. And so in certain cases where the context is not optimal, it could be maybe better to implement more simpler method that will be less robust, maybe, but that also come at a lower cost and that would be more adapted to your context. For the constraints, I mostly mentioned the most important one of them. In our case, it was really that we could not implement a monetary attribute in the discrete choice experiment, which led us to not being able to quantify the trade-offs, the preferences of farmers, and so the methodology really loses its scientific interest, I would say, when you are not able to do that, which is why we changed the methodology. We also had issues with the final sample of farmers that we could send their survey to, which was actually rather small. We were dependent on the region on that side, and so we could only send the survey to the farmers that are actually currently involved in the scheme. So it also lost some kind of value in terms of representativeness. For future applications, what I would say is that it would be more interesting if the lead of the evaluation, the lead of the study, and the lead of the use of the tool would come from managing authorities, because they can then really adapt the tool to their reality, their timelines, sorry, and etc. But since the tool is really, well, it requires technical expertise, it's really important that the managing authority cooperates with technical experts, or that there's some form of capacity building in the process, at least. Well, the last one, institutionalization and resource planning, it's kind of in the same directions. The tools should be integrated into the policy cycle, since they take so much, since they take time to implement, to really be able to plan in advance, make sure that all of the necessary inputs will be available, and to optimize the cost efficiency. It's really important then to take them into account in the policy cycle. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.